The shovel strikes something hard beneath the Jordanian sand, and the sound echoes across the Wadi Musa valley like a gunshot. Dr. Michael Jenkins freezes, his breath catching in his throat as he drops to his knees. His hands, trembling despite 20 years of fieldwork, begin brushing away the ancient sediment. Within minutes, the unmistakable edge of carved limestone emerges, exactly 3 meters below the surface, precisely where it should not exist. This is impossible. Every geological survey, every historical record, every established timeline of human settlement in this region categorically denies what Jenkins now touches with his own fingers. Yet, here it lies, undeniable and solid, a ceremonial altar bearing inscriptions that predate any known civilization in this area by nearly a millennium. The location, the depth, the very existence of this artifact contradicts everything archaeology has taught him to believe. But impossibility becomes something else entirely when Jenkins pulls a worn notebook from his pack. Inside, sketched in hasty pencil strokes 6 months earlier, is this exact site. The drawing shows the precise topography, the depth measurements, even the approximate size of the object he has just uncovered. The artist who created this sketch had never set foot in Jordan. She had never studied archaeology. She had simply closed her eyes in a university laboratory thousands of miles away and described what she saw. Her name is not important yet. What matters is the question that now burns in Jenkins' mind as he stares at the impossible made real. Can the human consciousness truly reach backward through time, perceiving events and objects separated from us by thousands of years? More troubling still, if the answer is yes, what does that mean about the nature of time itself, about memory, about the very fabric of reality we take for granted? Welcome to the controversial, unnerving world of psychic archaeology. This is the practice where individuals claiming extrasensory perception guide trained scientists to discoveries that conventional methods have missed. Some call it pseudoscience, a dangerous contamination of rigorous academic discipline with New Age fantasy. Others whisper that it works far too often to dismiss, that something genuine and deeply unsettling is happening at the intersection of human consciousness and ancient history. The cases pile up, each one more difficult to explain away. In 1979, a psychic named Aaron Abrahamson led excavators in Virginia to a previously undiscovered colonial foundation. In 1982, researcher Stephan coordinated remote viewers who pinpointed the location of the lighthouse of Alexandria beneath Mediterranean waters. In 1994, a woman in California described in minute detail a Bronze Age settlement in England that archaeologists found exactly where she indicated, containing artifacts matching her vision with disturbing precision. These are not vague predictions retrofitted to match random findings. These are specific coordinates, detailed descriptions, architectural features that psychics sketched before shovels ever broke ground. When they are right in ways that make conventional explanation crumble like ancient pottery. But here is where the story darkens, where excitement curdles into something closer to dread. Because if these visions are genuine, if human consciousness can somehow access information embedded in locations across vast stretches of time, then we must confront an uncomfortable reality. Not everything buried in the earth was meant to be found. Not every secret locked in the past serves humanity by emerging into light. Some psychics who have worked archaeological sites report visions that go beyond mere artifact location. They describe violence, rituals, deliberate concealment of objects meant to remain hidden. They wake from sessions with unexplained marks on their skin, with knowledge they cannot rationally possess, with warnings they cannot explain. Several have refused to continue working after what they perceived, declining to specify what they saw, but making it clear that some discoveries carry a weight that excavation cannot prepare you for. What happens when a psychic vision reveals not just where something is buried, but why it was buried? What if certain objects were hidden with intention, with purpose, with the hope that time and earth would keep them separated from the living world? And what responsibility do we bear when we ignore those ancient warnings? This is not a comfortable topic for academic archaeology. The field has spent centuries establishing itself as a rigorous science, built on stratigraphy and carbon dating and peer-reviewed methodology. To acknowledge that consciousness might operate outside known physical laws that perception might not be bound by linear time, threatens the very foundation of how we understand both archaeology and human capability. Yet the evidence refuses to disappear. The successful cases continue to accumulate. And perhaps most tellingly, many of the archaeologists who have worked with genuine psychics, the ones who have held artifacts in their hands that should not exist where they were found, become very quiet when pressed for their private opinions. They stop making categorical denials. They start using phrases like unexplained correlation and statistically anomalous success rates. In the episodes ahead, we will examine the most compelling cases where psychic archaeology has produced undeniable results. We will walk through the methods, the successes, and the failures. We will hear from the scientists who have participated, sometimes reluctantly, in these experiments. We will explore the theoretical frameworks that might, just might, explain how consciousness could access information across time. But we will also venture into darker territory. We will investigate cases where excavations guided by psychic vision unearthed things that brought no celebration, only questions and sometimes fear. We will examine whether some knowledge comes with a cost, whether some artifacts carry more than historical value, whether the past can reach forward to touch those who disturb it. The shovel has struck stone. The impossible has been found. Now we must decide what to do with discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew about time, consciousness, and the boundaries of human perception. The Earth keeps its secrets until it does not. And sometimes, when those secrets emerge, we understand too late why they were hidden. On the 10th of August, 1901, two eminently respectable English academics took a walk that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were not the sort of women given to flights of fancy. Moberly, the daughter of a bishop, served as the first principal of St. Hugh's College at Oxford. Jourdain taught there as well, a woman of sharp intellect and careful observation. They had traveled to France during the summer holiday, visiting the sites around Paris with the methodical attention to detail that defined their professional lives. That afternoon, they decided to visit the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the intimate chateau that had once been Marie Antoinette's private retreat from court life. What began as an ordinary tourist excursion would become one of the most meticulously documented cases of temporal displacement ever recorded. The day itself seemed unremarkable at first. The two women left the main palace grounds in the early afternoon, walking through the formal gardens toward the smaller estate. They carried a guidebook, though later they would disagree about exactly which paths they had followed. The weather was warm, typical for August in the Ile-de-France region, but as they approached the area around the Petit Trianon, both women later reported that something in the atmosphere began to shift. The quality of light seemed to change, though neither could articulate precisely how. The sounds of other tourists faded away. A peculiar heaviness settled over everything, a sensation Moberly would later describe as oppressive and unnatural, as though the air itself had become thicker, harder to breathe. They encountered their first figure near a garden kiosk. A man sat there, wearing what struck them as oddly old-fashioned clothes, though in the moment they assumed he might be a gardener in some sort of traditional uniform. His face, Moberly later wrote, filled her with an inexplicable dread. There was something deeply wrong about him, she insisted, though she could not explain what. The man did not acknowledge their presence, did not move or respond when they passed nearby. His stillness was absolute, unnatural. Jourdain felt it too, this creeping sense of wrongness, though her experience of it was less intense than her companions. They walked on, now thoroughly disoriented. The paths did not seem to match their guidebook. Structures appeared that should not have been there. A small bridge crossed a ravine that neither woman could later locate on any map of the gardens. The landscape itself seemed subtly different, the arrangement of trees and paths not quite matching what they expected. Then they saw two men in long grayish-green coats and small tricorn hats. Again, the clothing registered as unusual, perhaps some sort of period costume, but not impossible for groundskeepers at a historical site. The men directed them forward with curt gestures, speaking little. Their manner was brusque, almost hostile, and both women felt increasingly anxious to leave this strange, oppressive atmosphere behind. As they approached the Petit Trianon itself, Moberly saw a woman sitting on the grass near the terrace. She was sketching, dressed in a light-colored fichu and a full skirt, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. There was something about her, Moberly would later insist, that commanded attention. She seemed more vivid than her surroundings, more present, yet simultaneously dreamlike. The woman turned slightly, and Moberly glimpsed her profile. She did not speak to her. She did not approach. But the image seared itself into her memory with uncomfortable clarity. At that moment, a young man appeared, seemingly from nowhere, and directed them urgently toward the house. His sudden appearance startled them both. They followed his directions, climbing the steps to the terrace, and suddenly the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Other tourists appeared. The sounds of the modern world rushed back in. Everything was normal again, as though they had passed through some invisible membrane back into their own time. Neither woman spoke much about the experience immediately afterward. They were both unsettled, but they processed it separately, privately. It was not until a week later, when Jourdain asked Moberly if she remembered the woman in the hat, that they realized they needed to discuss what had happened. Moberly had assumed Jourdain meant the woman sketching near the terrace, but Jourdain had not seen that woman at all. What she had seen was a different figure, a woman standing near a cottage that Moberly had not noticed. Their accounts overlapped in some places and diverged in others, which paradoxically lent them credibility. If they had fabricated the story together, their narratives would have matched perfectly. What happened next elevated this from a curious anecdote to a genuinely compelling mystery. The two women began to research their experience with the same scholarly rigor they applied to their academic work. They returned to Versailles multiple times, trying to retrace their steps. But the landscape had changed. The bridge was gone. The paths did not match their memories. Certain buildings they remembered seeing simply were not there. They consulted historical documents, maps, architectural drawings from the 18th century, and slowly, impossibly, a pattern emerged. Many of the structures they had seen, the ones that were not present in 1901, had existed in 1789. A small kiosk, long demolished, appeared in plans from before the Revolution. The bridge Moberly remembered had been torn down in 1785. The cottage Jourdain described matched historical records of a structure that had been removed in the 1790s. The layout of the paths, which did not match the modern gardens, corresponded precisely to maps drawn during Marie Antoinette's lifetime. Detail after detail aligned with the geography of Versailles, as it had existed over a century before their visit. The clothing they described also matched the period. The long grayish-green coats and tricorn hats worn by the men they encountered were consistent with the uniforms of the Swiss Guard who had served at Versailles before the Revolution. The woman's fichu and wide-brimmed hat matched fashion plates from the late 1780s. Moberly became convinced that the woman she had seen sketching was Marie Antoinette herself, though she was careful never to state this as certainty, only as a deeply held belief. Both women wrote detailed accounts of their experience separately, then compared them. They were questioned repeatedly over the years by researchers, skeptics, and curiosity seekers. Their story never changed in its essential details, though they added layers of research and historical context as they learned more about Versailles in the late 18th century. In 1911, they published their account under the pseudonym Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lamont in a book titled An Adventure. The work caused an immediate sensation. Critics emerged quickly. Some suggested the women had encountered actors rehearsing for a costume pageant, but no records of any such event at Versailles on that date have ever been found. Others proposed they had stumbled upon a private party where guests wore period dress. Again, no evidence supports this theory, and it fails to explain the architectural anomalies or the oppressive atmosphere both women describe. Some skeptics argued they had simply misremembered, conflating multiple visits, or unconsciously incorporating historical knowledge into false memories. But this explanation struggles against the specificity of their accounts and the details they could not have known without access to obscure archival materials they had not yet consulted when they first wrote down their experiences. The emotional component of their testimony adds another layer of strangeness. Both women described feeling a profound sense of wrongness, of dread, particularly in the presence of the first man they encountered near the kiosk. This was not the pleasant thrill of seeing something historical or interesting. It was oppressive, disturbing, almost sickening. Moberly in particular seemed traumatized by it, and she struggled to convey the depth of her distress in writing. She used words like menacing, unnatural, evil. This emotional coloring does not fit neatly with the idea of a misidentified costume party or a simple case of mistaken identity. Architectural historians who later examined their account confirmed that the women described features of the grounds that were not common knowledge in 1901. Some of these details would only be verified decades later through archival research. The specific configuration of certain pathways, the location of demolished structures, the arrangement of plantings in the gardens as they had existed before 1789. These were not things that could be easily found in tourist guidebooks or even standard historical texts of the period. Both women lived long lives. Moberly died in 1937, Jourdain in 1924. Neither ever recanted their story. Neither profited significantly from it, though their book went through multiple editions. They endured ridicule from some quarters and fascination from others. They were serious scholars with reputations to protect, and going public with such a bizarre claim was, if anything, a professional liability. Yet they stood by their account, refining it, researching it, but never fundamentally changing it. The Moberly-Jourdain case remains one of the most compelling alleged time slips ever recorded precisely because of what it lacked. There is no obvious motive for fabrication. There is no evidence of fraud or collusion. The internal consistency of their accounts, despite being written separately, suggests genuine experience rather than invention. The architectural and historical details they described, many of which they could not have known at the time, continue to align with scholarly understanding of Versailles as it existed in the 1780s. What they experienced that August afternoon remains unexplained. If it was hallucination, both women hallucinated architectural features that happened to correspond with historical reality. If it was fabrication, they fabricated details they had no way of knowing. If it was a genuine temporal displacement, a moment when past and present somehow folded together, it suggests that time may not function in the linear, immutable way we assume. The Versailles time slip, as it has come to be known, stands at the threshold between the explicable and the impossible, a carefully documented anomaly that refuses easy dismissal. The morning mist clung to the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey in the autumn of 1907, when Frederick Bligh first walked through the crumbling arches that would define his destiny. He came with impeccable credentials, a trained architect and a respected archaeologist, chosen by the Church of England to direct excavations at one of Britain's most sacred sites. What Bond could not have known, standing there among the weathered stones with his surveying equipment and notebooks, was that his greatest discoveries would come not from methodical academic research, but from conversations with the dead. Within 2 decades, he would unearth architectural wonders that had been lost for 4 centuries, pinpoint buried chapels with uncanny precision, and then watch as his career crumbled into professional ruin for the crime of revealing exactly how he had accomplished these remarkable feats. Bond appeared, by all accounts, to be the perfect choice for such a prestigious appointment. Born in 1864 into a family of architects, he had studied the Gothic Revival style extensively and possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of medieval church architecture. His analytical mind and meticulous attention to detail had earned him respect among his peers. He understood stratigraphy, the importance of careful documentation, and the painstaking nature of proper excavation technique. The Church of England Antiquarian Society believed they had found a cautious, methodical scholar who would approach the Glastonbury excavations with appropriate academic rigor. They had no idea that Bond harbored a secret fascination with the occult, with spiritualism, and with the possibility that knowledge could flow across the barrier between life and death. The challenge facing Bond was daunting. Glastonbury Abbey had been systematically destroyed during King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in 1539. What had once been the wealthiest and most magnificent abbey in England was reduced to rubble, its stones carted away for building material, its treasures scattered or melted down, its monks dispersed or executed. By the early 20th century, little remained but fragmentary walls rising from overgrown fields, and contradictory historical accounts about what had once stood there. Bond's task was to locate specific structures mentioned in medieval documents, particularly the Edgar Chapel and the Loretto Chapel, two buildings that many of his colleagues believed had never actually existed, dismissing them as pious invention or historical confusion. On a November evening in 1907, Bond sat with his friend John Allen Bartlett in a quiet room far from the Abbey grounds. Bartlett, known to friends as John, was a Welsh metalworker with no formal education in history or archaeology, but he possessed what spiritualists of the era called sensitive abilities. He could enter trance states and perform automatic writing, his hand moving across paper to produce words and images that seemed to come from beyond his conscious mind. Bond, despite his respectable academic position, had long been curious about such phenomena. That evening, they decided to conduct an experiment. Bond would ask questions about the Abbey's lost structures, and Bartlett would allow his hand to write whatever responses emerged. What happened next would have seemed absurd if it had not proven so remarkably accurate. Bartlett's hand began to move in flowing script, quite unlike his normal handwriting, producing messages signed with names like Johannes, a monk who claimed to have been custodian of the Abbey centuries earlier, and Guillielmus, allegedly a medieval architect, intimately familiar with the building. These supposed spirits did not speak in vague mystical pronouncements. Instead, they provided specific architectural measurements, precise locations for buried foundations, and detailed descriptions of stonework and chapel layouts. They sketched floor plans. They identified where Bond should dig to find particular structures. They described decorative elements, window placements, and construction techniques with the technical vocabulary of medieval masons. Bond was both skeptical and intrigued. He kept detailed records of these automatic writing sessions, filling notebooks with the communications while revealing them to no one at his dig site. The true test would come when he put spade to earth. In 1908, following coordinates provided through Bartlett's trance writings, Bond directed his workers to excavate in an area where no historical documents suggested anything significant existed. Within days, they uncovered the foundations of the Edgar Chapel, precisely where the supposed spirit monks had indicated it would be. The dimensions matched the measurements provided in the automatic writing sessions. Stone courses appeared exactly as described. Architectural details that Bond had carefully recorded from his psychic communications proved correct when the physical evidence emerged from the soil. The discoveries continued with unsettling accuracy. The spirits had indicated that two chapels once stood at the eastern end of the Abbey church, the Edgar Chapel to the north and the Loretto Chapel to the south. They provided precise measurements showing that the Edgar Chapel extended 30 feet beyond the main church structure and was 25 feet wide. When Bond's excavation team uncovered the actual foundations, they conformed to these dimensions within inches. The spirits described a particular type of decorative stonework, a style of buttressing, and specific floor levels. Each detail proved correct as the earth yielded its secrets. In 1909, Bond located the foundations of the Loretto Chapel, again following guidance from the automatic writing sessions. His colleagues at the site marveled at his apparent intuition, his uncanny ability to know exactly where to dig. The Church of England Antiquarian Society praised his methodical approach and celebrated his remarkable finds. Archaeological journals published his discoveries, noting that Bond had definitively proven the existence of structures that many scholars had dismissed as medieval fantasy. Glastonbury Abbey was yielding treasures that expanded understanding of English ecclesiastical architecture. Bond's reputation soared. Visitors came to view the excavations. The director was hailed as a brilliant archaeologist with an almost supernatural sense for locating buried remains. But Bond was troubled by his deception. The automatic writing sessions with Bartlett continued throughout the excavation years, providing increasingly detailed information. The supposed monk Johannes offered not just architectural facts, but historical narratives, descriptions of abbey life, accounts of rituals, and daily routines. The communications took on a deeply personal quality. Bond found himself forming a strange bond with these alleged medieval personalities. Whether they were genuine spirits, fragments of historical consciousness somehow accessible through Bartlett's trance states, or elaborate constructions from the unconscious minds of both men, Bond could not deny their utility. They told him things he had no other way of knowing, things that proved accurate when tested against physical evidence. By 1915, Bond had made the decision that would destroy his career. He believed the world deserved to know the truth about his methods. He prepared a manuscript titled The Gate of Remembrance that documented the automatic writing sessions in detail, including transcripts of the communications with the supposed spirits and careful comparisons between their descriptions and what had actually been excavated. He argued that he had stumbled upon a genuine phenomenon, a way of accessing historical information through psychic means that deserved serious investigation rather than automatic dismissal. He believed his archaeological success validated the method that empirical results should outweigh theoretical objections. The book was published in 1918, and the reaction was swift and devastating. The Church of England was horrified. The institution that employed Bond had no tolerance for occult practices, for seances, for conversations with spirits, regardless of whether they produced accurate archaeological data. To the church authorities, Bond had admitted to practicing forbidden arts, to dabbling in spiritualism, to methods that bordered on the demonic. His defense, that the results spoke for themselves, that he had uncovered genuine historical structures using information obtained through automatic writing, only made matters worse. He was not merely mistaken in their eyes, he was dangerously unorthodox. A man who had allowed superstition to guide what should have been rigorous scientific inquiry. The archaeological establishment was equally harsh. Colleagues who had praised Bond's excavation work now questioned whether he had perhaps found old maps he had not acknowledged, whether he had stumbled across historical documents he failed to credit properly. Some suggested he had deliberately deceived everyone, that he had possessed conventional knowledge of the Abbey's layout all along and invented the psychic communication story for publicity. Others simply could not reconcile the undeniable success of his excavations with the absurdity of his claimed methods. Academic journals that had published his findings now published rebuttals. Former admirers distanced themselves. The consensus formed quickly. Bond had achieved real archaeological results, but his explanation for how he achieved them was either fraudulent or delusional. In 1921, Bond was dismissed from his position at Glastonbury Abbey. The Church of England Antiquarian Society severed all connection with him. At 57 years old, with 2 decades of the century's most significant Abbey excavations to his credit, Bond found himself professionally exiled. No academic institution would hire him. No archaeological society would grant him membership. His methods, regardless of their results, had marked him as unreliable, unscientific, unsuitable for scholarly work. The evidence of his success remained literally carved in stone. The Edgar Chapel foundations stood exactly where the automatic writing had placed them. The Loreto Chapel matched the dimensions provided by supposed spirits. Architectural details unknown to any living person until Bond excavated them had been accurately described in his notebooks years before the earth was moved. Later archaeologists working at Glastonbury confirmed Bond's findings, acknowledged the importance of his excavations, but carefully avoided any mention of his methods. They treated his work as if he had used conventional research techniques, crediting his results while erasing the uncomfortable truth of how he claimed to have achieved them. Bond spent his remaining years writing increasingly esoteric books about Glastonbury's mystical significance, about its connections to Arthurian legend and early Christianity. He moved to America in 1926, lecturing to small groups of spiritualists and occult enthusiasts, the only audiences still willing to hear him speak. He died in 1945, largely forgotten by the archaeological profession that had once celebrated him. His obituaries in academic journals were brief and tactful, mentioning his excavation work at Glastonbury, while politely omitting the psychic controversies that had ended his career. The strange case of Frederick Bligh Bond poses uncomfortable questions that remain unresolved a century later. If his methods were fraudulent, how did he locate buried structures with such precision? If he somehow possessed conventional knowledge of the Abbey's layout, why have historians never found the documents he supposedly used? If the automatic writing produced only lucky guesses, how do we explain the accumulation of accurate architectural details across dozens of sessions? And if we entertain the possibility that Bond and Bartlett genuinely accessed historical information through psychic means, what does that imply about consciousness, memory, and the nature of knowledge itself? Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Bond's story is not whether ghosts of medieval monks actually communicated through automatic writing, but rather what his professional destruction reveals about the limits of acceptable inquiry. He found what he set out to find. He proved skeptics wrong about the Edgar and Loretto chapels. He expanded understanding of one of England's most important historical sites. His crime was not failure, but rather the unforgivable act of succeeding through methods that respectable society could not acknowledge. The stones he uncovered remain, silent testimony to discoveries made through means that cost everything to reveal. In the autumn of 1935, a group of archaeologists from the University of Warsaw gathered in a small laboratory room to witness something that would challenge everything they understood about the limits of human perception. They had brought with them 7 packages, each wrapped in thick opaque paper and sealed with wax. Inside these packages were artifacts that had been excavated from various sites across Poland, objects that had not seen daylight for thousands of years. The scientists had numbered the packages, but kept no record of which contained what. Into this room walked a middle-aged man with intense, dark eyes and a nervous demeanor. His name was Stephan Ossowiecki, and he claimed he could see things that existed beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Ossowiecki had not requested this meeting. In fact, he rarely sought out such encounters. The archaeologists had come to him, driven by rumors that had circulated through academic circles about a psychic who could somehow perceive the distant past with unsettling accuracy. They were skeptics by training, men who dealt in pottery shards and carbon dating, not supernatural claims. But they had also heard enough credible testimony to warrant investigation. The protocol they established was rigid. Ossowiecki would hold each package without opening it. He would describe what he perceived. Only after he had finished with all 7 packages would they be opened, and his statements verified against the actual contents. The first package felt heavy in his hands. Ossowiecki closed his eyes, and the room fell silent, except for the scratch of pencils as observers documented every word he spoke. He described a stone tool, an axe head made from dark flint. He specified that it was roughly triangular, with one edge carefully chipped to create a cutting surface. The original maker, he said, had been left-handed. The tool was old, older than any known settlement in the region, dating back perhaps 15,000 years. When he set the package down, his hands were trembling. The second package brought a change in his breathing. His face paled, and those watching noted a thin line of perspiration forming on his brow. He spoke of bone, worked bone from a large animal, carved into what might have been a needle or an awl. The people who made this, he said, lived in hide tents near a river that no longer flowed along the same path. He could see them, he whispered, as if looking through a window into another time. A woman sat by firelight, using this very tool to pierce leather. She was singing something, though he could not hear the melody. When the archaeologists finally opened the packages, the accuracy of his descriptions sent a chill through the room. The first package did indeed contain a Paleolithic axe head, dark flint, triangular, with the distinctive wear pattern of left-handed use. The second held a bone awl, precisely as he had described. Of the 7 packages, Ossowiecki accurately identified the contents and characteristics of 6 dii. The 7th, he admitted, gave him nothing but a sense of emptiness and confusion, which proved appropriate when it was revealed to contain only sand from the excavation site. But it was what happened next that truly captured the attention of the archaeological community. Ossowiecki spoke to the lead archaeologist, Professor Julian Talko-Hryncewicz, about a vision that had been troubling him for weeks. He described a place southwest of Warsaw, near a bend in the Vistula River, where the land rose slightly above the surrounding plain. In this place, he insisted, lay the remains of a substantial Paleolithic settlement. He drew maps without hesitation, marking specific locations where he claimed the densest concentration of artifacts could be found. He described the settlement in vivid detail, how the shelters had been arranged, where the tool-making areas had been situated, even the approximate number of people who had lived there during its peak occupation. The archaeologists were understandably skeptical. The area Ossowiecki described had never shown any surface indications of prehistoric habitation. No artifacts had been found there by farmers, no telltale soil discolorations visible from the surface. Yet something in the specificity of his vision compelled them to investigate. In the spring of 1936, they began test excavations at the site. Within 3 days, they struck evidence of human habitation. Within 2 weeks, they had uncovered one of the most significant Paleolithic sites ever discovered in Poland. The settlement proved to be exactly where Ossowiecki had indicated, positioned just as he had described. The density of artifacts, the arrangement of dwelling areas, the location of tool-making workshops, all corresponded to the map he had drawn in that laboratory months earlier. Radiocarbon dating, conducted years later, would place the settlement at approximately 12,000 years old. News of the discovery spread through European archaeological circles, and Ossowiecki found himself increasingly sought after for consultations. Universities and museums brought him sealed containers, asked him to locate dig sites, sought his impressions of artifacts whose origins puzzled conventional analysis. He cooperated with these requests, but those close to him noticed a disturbing change. The work was taking a toll that went far beyond simple fatigue. Ossowiecki began to speak openly about the psychological burden of his abilities, describing experiences that sounded less like useful visions and more like invasive hallucinations. When he touched ancient objects, he said, he did not simply observe the past. He experienced it. He felt the cold that Paleolithic peoples felt, smelled the smoke from their fires, tasted the food they ate. More disturbing still, he claimed to experience their emotions, their fears, their moments of pain and death. These were not gentle historical tableaus. They crashed into his consciousness with the force of lived memory, displacing his sense of present reality. After one session with a collection of bone fragments from a Neolithic burial site, Ossowiecki reportedly spent 2 days in a state of near collapse. He told colleagues that he had experienced the death of the person whose bones he had touched, felt the fever that consumed them, endured the terror of their final moments. The boundary between his identity and theirs had dissolved, leaving him uncertain for hours afterward about who and when he was. Time, he said, was not the neat linear progression that people assumed. The past was not dead and buried. It existed alongside the present, separated only by the thinnest of veils, and his curse was that he could not help but tear through that veil whenever he encountered its remnants. His descriptions of these experiences grew more disturbing as the 1930s progressed. He spoke of seeing not just individual moments but vast stretches of time, watching generations of people live and die in the space of minutes. He described the sensation as overwhelming, a flood of sensory information and emotional intensity that his mind struggled to process. The ancient world, he insisted, was far more violent and harsh than modern people imagined, and bearing witness to that violence left scars on his psyche. He began to refuse certain requests, particularly those involving human remains. The cost, he said, was simply too high. Friends and family noted his increasing isolation. The confident, sociable man they had known became withdrawn and anxious. He suffered from terrible nightmares, waking visions that blurred the line between sleep and waking life. In letters from this period, he wrote about feeling haunted, pursued by the ghosts of millennia. The prehistoric world he accessed through his visions would not release him even when he wished to retreat into the comforting boundaries of the 20th century. Despite these struggles, Ossowiecki continued to work with researchers who approached him with respect and genuine scientific curiosity. Controlled experiments continued, each one meticulously documented, each one adding to a growing file of evidence that his abilities, whatever their source, produced results that defied conventional explanation. Archaeologists brought him objects from cultures and time periods he could not have studied, from regions he had never visited, and he described them with an accuracy that statistical analysis suggested could not be attributed to chance. Then came September of 1939, and the world Ossowiecki knew shattered in ways that made his psychological torments seem almost quaint by comparison. The German invasion of Poland brought immediate and catastrophic change. As a prominent Polish intellectual, and worse still, a man of Jewish ancestry, Ossowiecki faced mortal danger. The documented experiments, the carefully compiled evidence of his abilities, the correspondence with scientists across Europe, all of this became suddenly and terribly irrelevant in the face of systematic destruction. What happened to Stephan Ossowiecki during the war years remains shrouded in mystery and conflicting reports. Some accounts claim he went into hiding in Warsaw, moving from safe house to safe house as the occupation tightened its grip. Others suggest he fled to the countryside, attempting to lose himself among the peasant population. A few sources indicate he may have been sheltered by members of the Polish resistance, protected because his abilities, some believed, might prove useful in the struggle against occupation. The most widely accepted account holds that Ossowiecki was captured and executed sometime during the war, likely between 1942 and 1944, though the exact circumstances and date remain unknown. No death certificate was ever produced. No grave was ever identified. He simply vanished into the chaos of wartime Poland, one among millions who disappeared into that darkness. Some of his colleagues who survived the war claimed to have heard reports of his death. Others held out hope that he had somehow escaped, perhaps to the Soviet Union or further east, though no evidence ever emerged to support such survival. What is certain is that the vast majority of documentation regarding his work was lost. The meticulous records kept by Warsaw University researchers were destroyed when the city burned. Private collections held by scientists who had worked with Ossowiecki were scattered, confiscated, or deliberately destroyed. The carefully controlled experiments, the sealed package tests, the maps of archaeological sites, the detailed accounts of his visions, nearly all of it vanished into the same void that consumed so much of European intellectual life during those years. A few fragments survived, preserved by researchers who had fled Poland before the invasion or hidden away by those who remained. These scattered documents, interview transcripts, and second-hand accounts form the basis of what we know about Stephan Ossowiecki today. They are enough to establish that something remarkable occurred in those controlled laboratory settings, enough to confirm that his archaeological predictions proved accurate in ways that cannot easily be dismissed. But they are not enough to fully understand the man or the genuine nature of his abilities. In the decades since, parapsychology researchers have pointed to Ossowiecki as one of the most credible cases of psychic phenomena on record, noting the scientific rigor of the experiments and the caliber of the researchers who investigated him. Skeptics counter that the loss of primary documentation makes verification impossible, that memory and legend have inevitably distorted whatever truth once existed. Both positions contain validity, and the mystery remains unresolved. What haunts the imagination is not just the question of whether Ossowiecki could genuinely see into deep time, but what such an ability would cost the person who possessed it. If we take his accounts of psychological trauma seriously, they suggest that some doorways, once opened, cannot easily be closed. The past he accessed was not the sanitized, comfortable history of textbooks and museum displays. It was raw and immediate, filled with the texture of lived experience across vast gulfs of time. To carry such visions, to be unable to escape them, suggests a burden that might explain his evident suffering in those final peacetime years. Somewhere in the ruins of mid-20th century Europe, the truth about Stephan Ossowiecki was lost, buried as thoroughly as the Paleolithic settlements he once located with such uncanny precision. We are left with fragments, tantalizing suggestions of abilities that challenge our understanding of human consciousness and its relationship to time. And we are left with the unsettling question of whether such abilities, if they exist, might be less gift than curse, less supernatural power than unbearable affliction. In the spring of 1973, a young archaeologist named Jeffrey Goodman stood at the edge of a meadow in Flagstaff, Arizona, holding a crude map drawn by a man who claimed to receive visions from the spirit world. The map showed precise locations where Goodman would supposedly find evidence of human habitation dating back 100,000 years, artifacts that would rewrite the entire story of human migration to the Americas. Goodman was a recent graduate from the University of Arizona with a doctorate in anthropology, ambitious and eager to make his mark on a field dominated by established scholars with their entrenched theories about when and how humans first arrived in North America. The prevailing view held that people had crossed the Bering Land Bridge roughly 13,000 years ago, spreading south through an ice-free corridor. Goodman believed this timeline was wrong, catastrophically wrong, and he thought he had found the key to proving it. The psychic was named Aron Abrahamson, a man who had no formal training in archaeology or geology, but who claimed to receive detailed information about ancient sites through extrasensory perception. Abrahamson would enter trance states and describe what he saw, providing coordinates and depths where specific artifacts could be found. When Goodman first approached him, Abrahamson had never visited Flagstaff, had never studied southwestern archaeology, yet he provided remarkably specific predictions about what lay beneath the volcanic soil near the San Francisco Peak. He told Goodman exactly where to dig, how deep to go, and what types of tools and bones would be waiting in the earth. The first excavation began in June of 1973, and what happened next sent ripples through the archaeological community. Goodman's team began finding artifacts in locations and at depths that closely matched Abrahamson's predictions. Stone tools emerged from the test pits, along with what appeared to be worked bone and evidence of fire pits. The initial radiocarbon dates seemed promising, suggesting ages far older than conventional theories allowed. Word spread quickly through academic circles. Here was physical evidence, found through the most unconventional means imaginable, that appeared to support the existence of a far earlier human presence in the Americas than anyone had dared to propose. Goodman published his preliminary findings and began giving lectures at universities and conferences. He was careful at first, measured in his claims, acknowledging the controversial nature of his methods while emphasizing the physical evidence. Some archaeologists were intrigued despite their skepticism about the psychic involvement. After all, the artifacts were real, tangible objects that could be dated and analyzed. The precise predictions bothered them, seemed too accurate to be coincidental, but the scientific method demanded they evaluate the evidence itself rather than dismiss it based on how it was obtained. A few respected researchers even visited the site, examining the stratigraphy and the artifacts in situ, and some came away troubled by what they could not easily explain. But then something shifted in the project, a darkening that began gradually before accelerating into something far stranger and more troubling. Abrahamson's visions started to expand beyond simple artifact location. He began describing elaborate prehistoric civilizations that had flourished in North America, cities and cultures with no basis in any archaeological record. He spoke of advanced technologies, of spiritual practices that defied understanding, of catastrophic events that had wiped entire peoples from existence. The dates he provided grew more extreme, pushing back not just thousands but hundreds of thousands of years, placing fully modern humans in the Americas at times when mainstream science insisted they had not yet evolved anywhere on Earth. Goodman began incorporating these visions into his interpretations of the site. The artifacts he was finding, he claimed, were evidence of these lost civilizations. Simple stone tools became proof of sophisticated cultures. Ordinary geological features were reinterpreted as the remnants of ancient structures. The measured scientist began to sound more like a mystic, speaking at conferences about revelations and hidden truths that the archaeological establishment refused to acknowledge because of their rigid adherence to outdated paradigms. He wrote a book titled American Genesis that proposed a radical revision of human prehistory, arguing that modern humans had actually originated in the Americas and spread outward to populate the rest of the world, inverting every established understanding of human evolution and migration. The academic response grew increasingly hostile. Established archaeologists began examining Goodman's published reports more critically, and troubling patterns emerged. The stratigraphy at the site seemed disturbed in ways that suggested recent intrusion into supposedly ancient layers. Artifacts from clearly different time periods appeared mixed together in contexts that made no geological sense. Some of the stone tools showed characteristics inconsistent with the ages Goodman claimed for them, displaying manufacturing techniques that had not been developed until much later periods. Questions arose about the chain of custody for artifacts, about who had access to the site between excavations, about whether proper protocols had been followed in documenting finds. Then, Abrahamson's visions took an even darker turn, spiraling into apocalyptic prophecies that had nothing to do with archaeology. He began predicting coming cataclysms, speaking of earth changes and spiritual transformations that would soon reshape human civilization. These prophecies bled into Goodman's work as he started suggesting that understanding the ancient past was crucial for humanity's survival in the approaching end times. The archaeological project became entangled with New Age mysticism and doomsday predictions, transforming from a scientific excavation into something that resembled a religious movement. The professional destruction came swiftly once the accusations of fraud began circulating openly. A team of independent archaeologists requested permission to conduct their own examination of the Flagstaff site. What they found devastated whatever remained of Goodman's credibility. The soil disturbances suggested that artifacts had been deliberately planted in supposedly undisturbed layers. Stone tools showed signs of recent chipping and breaking, damage consistent with being handled roughly during transport, rather than lying peacefully in the ground for millennia. Some artifacts appeared to have been taken from legitimate archaeological sites elsewhere and reburied in Flagstaff to be discovered, according to Abrahamson's predictions. The evidence pointed toward a systematic salting of the site, though proving deliberate fraud remained difficult. Goodman vehemently denied any deception, insisting that the artifacts were genuine finds and that any disturbances were the result of poor excavation techniques by student volunteers or natural geological processes. He argued that mainstream archaeologists were so threatened by his findings that they had launched a coordinated campaign to discredit him, unwilling to accept evidence that contradicted their cherished theories. But the damage was irreversible. Universities that had invited him to speak now canceled his lectures. Journals that had published his preliminary reports issued corrections and statements distancing themselves from his work. His doctoral advisor publicly disavowed the research. Abrahamson disappeared from public view as the scandal intensified, no longer offering visions or predictions about the site. Some said he had recognized how far things had gone astray and wanted no part of the controversy. Others claimed he had been a willing participant in the deception from the beginning, feeding Goodman information that the archaeologist wanted to hear, creating a feedback loop of confirmation bias and wishful thinking that spiraled out of control. Yet mysteries remained that troubled even the harshest critics. A few artifacts from the Flagstaff site could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Some stone tools, found in the earliest test pits before the project gained notoriety, displayed characteristics that genuinely puzzled experts. Their manufacturing techniques did not match known traditions, and their geological context remained ambiguous even after careful reanalysis. Were these legitimate anomalies, artifacts that hinted at complexities in American prehistory that mainstream archaeology had not yet recognized? Or were they simply unusual examples of known tool types, misidentified in the heat of controversy, and then given undue significance? Subsequent researchers who examined the site in later years found evidence of genuine Paleo-Indian occupation, artifacts dating to the accepted time frame of around 13,000 years ago. The area had indeed been used by ancient peoples, just not in the time frames or context that Goodman had claimed. This added another layer of complexity to the story. The site was not entirely fraudulent, but neither did it support the extraordinary claims that had been made for it. Reality existed somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground, where genuine archaeological material had been mixed with possibly planted artifacts, and then interpreted through the distorting lens of psychic visions and apocalyptic beliefs. Goodman's career never recovered from the scandal. He found himself unable to secure academic positions, his reputation permanently tainted by the accusations of fraud and his association with fringe theories. He continued writing books that pushed increasingly extreme ideas about human prehistory, but these were published by alternative presses and ignored by mainstream scholarship. The man who had once dreamed of revolutionizing archaeology became a cautionary tale. His name invoked as an example of what happens when the desire for discovery overrides scientific rigor. The story of the Flagstaff site serves as a stark reminder of how easily the search for truth can be derailed by our desire for revelations and our hunger for the extraordinary. Goodman began with a genuine passion for archaeology and a sincere belief that conventional theories might be wrong. These are not terrible starting points. Science advances when researchers question established paradigms. But somewhere along the way, his commitment to following the evidence became subordinated to his investment in a predetermined conclusion. The psychic visions provided what felt like a shortcut, a way to bypass the slow, painstaking work of proper archaeology. When the initial finds seemed to confirm the predictions, it created a seductive feedback loop that made it nearly impossible to step back and evaluate the evidence objectively. The mingling of apocalyptic prophecy with archaeological interpretation revealed something deeper and more troubling about how easily scientific inquiry can be compromised by other agendas. When understanding the past becomes tied to spiritual beliefs about the future, when excavation sites transform into stages for cosmic dramas about humanity's destiny, the careful methodology that makes archaeology reliable simply collapses. Facts become malleable, evidence gets reinterpreted to fit the narrative, and skepticism becomes viewed as obstruction rather than necessary rigor. The tragedy of Geoffrey Goodman lies not just in his professional destruction, but in the waste of what might have been. Had he approached the Flagstaff area with conventional methods, he might have contributed genuine knowledge about Paleo-Indian occupation in the region. Instead, his legacy is a salted site, bitter controversy, and a demonstration of how psychic archaeology leads not to discovery, but to self-deception and scandal. The visions that promised to reveal ancient truths ultimately obscured them, replacing careful science with fantasy and leaving behind only wreckage and unanswered questions buried in the Arizona soil. The Roman city of Pompeii has yielded many secrets since excavations began in the 18th century, but perhaps none more disturbing than what emerged when researchers decided to bring psychic mediums to the buried streets in the 1960s. What these sensitives experienced, and what their visions later revealed, challenges everything we think we know about death, memory, and the places where unspeakable tragedy has occurred. It started as an experiment, informal and unscientific by modern standards. In 1961, a team of Italian archaeologists working on a residential block near the Forum invited a local woman who claimed psychic abilities to walk through their excavation site. The archaeologists were skeptical, even mocking, treating it as afternoon entertainment. But when the woman reached a partially exposed building, she stopped speaking entirely. Her hands began to shake. She turned pale, backing away from the threshold, and refused to go further. When pressed about what she sensed, she could only whisper about heat, unbearable heat, and the sound of screaming that never stopped. The archaeologists laughed it off. They had heard plenty of local superstition about the ruins. But one researcher, Antonio Marcelli, noted the location in his journal, marking it with a question mark. 5 years later, in 1966, something far more specific occurred. British medium Iris Owen had never heard of that first experiment. She knew little about Pompeii beyond what any educated person might know from school textbooks. She had been brought to the site by a British documentary team filming a series on unexplained phenomena. The plan was simple enough. Walk Iris through several locations, film her reactions, perhaps capture something interesting for television. Nothing more elaborate than that. The crew expected vague pronouncements about ancient energy, the usual performance they had come to associate with psychic demonstrations. What happened instead left the entire film crew shaken for years afterward. Iris entered the archaeological park on a clear morning in June. For the first hour, she walked calmly, commenting on the beauty of the preserved frescoes, the tragedy of the lost city. She seemed entirely normal, engaged, and pleasant. Then the group turned down a side street called the Via dell'Abbondanza, heading toward a residential area where recent excavations had revealed several homes. The moment Iris stepped through the entrance of one particular building, later identified as the House of the Cryptoporticus, her entire demeanor changed. She stopped mid-sentence. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Camera operators later reported that the temperature seemed to drop, though the day remained warm. Iris began backing toward the doorway, shaking her head violently. She started speaking rapidly, words tumbling over each other in a voice the crew described as not quite her own. She talked about a family, parents and 2 children, trapped in a small room as the sky turned black. She described how they had sealed themselves in, stuffing cloth around the door's edges, believing the stone walls would protect them. She spoke about the father trying to comfort his daughter, telling her stories to drown out the sounds outside, the roaring and the screams. She described the mother holding an infant, singing lullabies even as the heat grew intense. Then Iris began to scream. Not a theatrical performance scream, but a raw, primal sound of absolute terror. She collapsed to her knees, clawing at her throat, gasping for air that would not come. The documentary director stopped filming and called for medical help, certain they were witnessing some kind of seizure. When Iris finally recovered, sitting in the shade outside the ruins with water and concerned faces around her, she could barely speak. She insisted on leaving immediately. She refused to discuss what she had experienced beyond repeating one phrase over and over. A small room. 4 people together. Unable to breathe. The documentary footage was deemed too disturbing to broadcast in full. Only brief clips ever aired, heavily edited, with Iris's screams reduced to a few seconds. Here is where the story takes its most chilling turn. 2 years later, in 1968, excavation of that specific house continued. Workers began carefully removing volcanic material from a sealed chamber that had gone unnoticed in earlier digs. As they worked, they discovered a cavity in the hardened ash. Using the technique pioneered decades earlier, they poured plaster into the void, creating a cast. What emerged were 4 human figures, 2 adults and 2 small children, huddled together in a space no larger than a modern bathroom. The family was positioned exactly as Iris had described. The larger male figure had his arms around the smaller form, protective even in death. The female figure clutched an infant to her chest. They had been found in a room that showed evidence of deliberate sealing, cloth fragments still visible around the doorframe. The posture suggested they had survived for some time, suffocating slowly as toxic gases seeped through their makeshift barriers. The archaeologists who had been present during Iris's collapse 2 years earlier were stunned. Antonio Marcelli, the same researcher who had witnessed the first psychic's reaction years before, began documenting these incidents systematically. What he discovered suggested a pattern far more extensive than anyone had realized. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, at least 7 other psychics or self-described sensitives were brought to Pompeii by various researchers, journalists, and curious investigators. None of them knew about Iris Owen. None had been briefed on specific locations beyond basic historical fact. Yet their experiences shared disturbing similarities. A German medium named Katrin Holst visited in 1973. She reported overwhelming sensations of burning whenever she entered certain buildings, despite the cool autumn weather. She described feeling as though she were suffocating, as though her lungs were filling with something thick and hot. She left after less than 2 hours, visibly distressed, and later wrote to the researchers explaining she would never return. The place held too much death, she wrote. The screams were still happening, over and over, like a recording that never stops playing. A French psychic named Jean-Paul Mercier spent 3 days in Pompeii in 1976 as part of a university study. He reported physical symptoms that baffled the medical observer present. Mercier developed burns on his hands and arms, red welts that appeared without apparent cause. He complained constantly of not being able to breathe properly, though oxygen tests showed normal levels. On the 3rd day, he refused to continue. In his written testimony, he described Pompeii as a place where time had broken, where the moment of death replayed endlessly for anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. But the most disturbing evidence came from something none of the researchers had planned. In 1979, an American parapsychologist named Dr. Eleanor Brennan decided to try a different approach. Instead of simply walking psychics through the ruins, she asked 4 different sensitives, brought to Pompeii at different times over 6 months, to draw or describe any specific faces or individuals they perceived. None of the 4 had met each other. None knew about the other's participation. 3 of the 4 psychics drew remarkably similar portraits of a young woman. The sketches showed a woman in her 20s or early 30s with a distinctive profile, a strong nose and chin, hair pulled back severely from her face. The details varied slightly in each drawing, but the core features remained consistent. All 3 described feeling this woman's terror, her desperate desire to live. One of the psychics, a woman from Australia named Margaret Bennett, became so distraught during the session that she tore up her sketch, crying that the face would not leave her mind, that she could feel the woman's last thoughts as if they were her own. Dr. Brennan filed these drawings away with her other research, unsure what to make of them. There were hundreds of body casts at Pompeii. Finding one that matched would be nearly impossible. And besides, the casts showed bodies in their death positions, faces often covered or distorted by their final agonies. Then, in 1982, excavations in the Garden of the Fugitives revealed a group of 13 bodies, victims who had been caught in the open during the eruption's final phase. One cast in particular drew attention. A young woman, preserved in remarkable detail, her face turned upward, mouth open in what might have been a scream or a final gasp for air. Her features were clearly visible, the volcanic material having captured them with terrible precision. When photographs of this cast reached Dr. Brennan, she pulled out the old sketches from 3 years earlier. The resemblance was unmistakable. The strong profile, the distinctive nose, the structure of the face, all matched the drawings the psychics had independently created. Dr. Brennan published her findings in a small parapsychology journal, but the implications were too disturbing for mainstream archaeology. The official response was predictable. Coincidence, suggestion, perhaps the psychics had seen photographs of other casts and created a composite. But those who had witnessed the sessions knew better. The details were too specific, the emotional reactions too genuine. What emerged from these experiences was a theory that made even skeptics uncomfortable. Perhaps places where massive numbers of people died in terror and agony retained some kind of imprint. Not a supernatural haunting in the traditional sense, but something more troubling. A temporal echo. A psychic wound in the fabric of a location where the final moments of hundreds of lives ended simultaneously in unimaginable suffering. The moment captured not in stone alone, but in something else. Something we do not yet have instruments to measure. The concept is not entirely without scientific parallels. We know that traumatic memories can be extraordinarily persistent, that the brain under extreme stress operates differently. Some researchers have theorized about quantum consciousness, about information potentially persisting in ways we do not fully understand. Could the intense electromagnetic activity of a volcanic eruption, combined with the neurological death patterns of hundreds of people dying simultaneously, create some kind of recording? Could that recording persist for thousands of years, waiting for minds sensitive enough to receive it? Several of the psychics who visited Pompeii reported feeling that they were not simply sensing the past, but somehow experiencing it, living through those final moments as if they were happening in the present. Time had not healed Pompeii's wounds. The 24 hours of terror that destroyed the city in August of the year 79 had somehow become permanent, accessible to those unfortunate enough to tune into the correct frequency. By the late 1980s, no reputable researchers were bringing psychics to Pompeii anymore. The experiments had stopped, partly due to ethical concerns about the distress caused to sensitives, partly because the results were too controversial to publish in mainstream journals. But the accounts remain, filed away in archives, recorded in interviews, documented in journals that few people read. Dozens of individuals, spanning 3 decades, reporting nearly identical experiences of terror, suffocation, and overwhelming collective death. Today, millions of tourists walk through Pompeii each year, taking photographs of the famous casts, marveling at the preserved buildings. Most feel nothing beyond historical curiosity, and perhaps a somber reflection on mortality. But occasionally, someone reports feeling uneasy in certain buildings, experiencing sudden difficulty breathing, sensing presences that cannot be explained. Tour guides have stories about visitors who become distressed for no apparent reason, who need to leave specific locations quickly, who later describe feelings they cannot quite articulate. The casts remain the most popular attraction. Families pose next to them for photographs. Children stare with wide eyes at these figures frozen in death. And somewhere in storage, in research archives, are sketches drawn by people who claim to see beyond the physical remains, who insisted they were seeing not just bodies but souls, not just history but active suffering. Whether you believe their claims or dismiss them as delusion, one fact remains undeniable. Something happened to these psychics at Pompeii, something that affected them profoundly and specifically. Something that, in multiple verified cases, revealed information they should not have known. Pompeii is not simply a historical site. It is a mass grave, the frozen moment of a city's death, preserved with such terrible completeness that perhaps the moment itself never truly ended. Perhaps for those who died there, that day of ash and fire continues eternally, their final terror echoing through centuries, waiting for minds that can hear their silent screams. In the burning heat of outback New South Wales during the autumn of 1998, a small team of archaeologists gathered at coordinates that had come to them not through academic research or historical documentation, but through the dreams of a woman who had never set foot in the region before. Her name was Margaret Hollis, a self-described psychic from Melbourne who had spent the better part of a year experiencing recurring visions of a site she claimed held significant Aboriginal artifacts and ceremonial objects. What began as an unconventional archaeological expedition would devolve into something far stranger, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a sealed location that remains under quiet surveillance to this very day. Margaret had approached Dr. James Kincaid, a respected but somewhat maverick archaeologist from the University of Sydney, with detailed sketches of rock formations, descriptions of underground chambers, and precise geographical markers that she insisted came to her in sleep. Kincaid was skeptical by nature and training, but something about the specificity of her claims intrigued him. The coordinates she provided pointed to a remote area northwest of Dubbo, in a stretch of land that was largely unexamined by modern archaeology. More compelling was that her descriptions matched geological features that would be difficult for someone without extensive knowledge of the region to fabricate. Against the advice of several colleagues, Kincaid assembled a small team of 4 researchers, secured limited funding from a private benefactor interested in alternative archaeology, and arranged for ground-penetrating radar equipment to survey the site before any digging commenced. When the team arrived in late March of that year, the location seemed unremarkable at first glance. Red earth stretched in all directions, punctuated by weathered eucalyptus and the occasional rock outcropping. But Margaret was adamant they had found the right place. She walked the perimeter of a specific area, roughly 30 meters in diameter, and declared with absolute certainty that beneath their feet lay something of profound importance. The radar survey, conducted over 3 days, revealed what the team initially celebrated as remarkable findings. The equipment detected clear anomalies approximately 4 to 6 meters below the surface. There were hollow spaces, density variations consistent with human-made structures, and what appeared to be distinct objects of varying sizes arranged in deliberate pattern. The excitement was palpable. Here was potential validation for psychic archaeology, a field dismissed by mainstream science, but one that had its proponents and a handful of intriguing anecdotal successes. Kincaid meticulously documented everything, knowing that if they made significant finds, the unconventional methodology would face intense scrutiny. They prepared to begin careful excavation, establishing a grid system and photographic protocols. But before the first shovel broke ground, something unexpected happened. A group of 3 Aboriginal elders from a community nearly 80 kilometers away arrived at the site unannounced. They had not been contacted about the expedition, and the team had not yet engaged in the consultation process that ethical archaeological practice demanded. The elders, 2 men and 1 woman whose names were never recorded in the official reports that would later circulate, approached the camp and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. What they told Kincaid was unambiguous. This place was protected. It was not meant to be disturbed. There were no artifacts here for outsiders to find, and attempting to excavate would bring consequences they could not fully explain but strongly advised against. Kincaid found himself in an ethical dilemma. He respected indigenous rights and recognized that proper consultation should have occurred before the expedition began. But he also had radar data showing clear anomalies, funding that had been spent, and a team that had come all this way. He asked the elders what made this particular site significant, whether it had ceremonial importance or cultural meaning that he should understand. Their response was cautious but firm. Some places hold things that should remain held. Some grounds should not be opened. They would say nothing more specific, but their warning carried a weight that left the entire team unsettled. Margaret, who had been present during this exchange, went pale. She told Kincaid that during the conversation with the elders, she had felt what she described as a pressure in her mind, as if something was pushing against her thoughts. That night, she dreamed again, but this time the visions were different. Instead of seeing artifacts waiting to be discovered, she saw darkness beneath the earth, something that felt aware and hostile to intrusion. Despite the warnings and Margaret's growing unease, Kincaid made the decision to proceed. He convinced himself that indigenous spiritual beliefs, while culturally important, did not constitute a scientific reason to abandon an expedition supported by concrete radar data. The team would be respectful, document everything properly, and if they found materials of cultural significance, they would immediately contact the appropriate indigenous organizations. It was a rationalization that would haunt him. The excavation began on the morning of April 2nd. Within hours, the equipment failures started. a generator that had been functioning perfectly seized without apparent cause. Battery-powered tools drained within minutes of use, requiring constant recharging. The ground-penetrating radar, brought back to verify the exact location of the anomalies, produced nonsensical readings that fluctuated wildly and bore no resemblance to the clear data from the initial survey. One team member, a graduate student named Paul Hendricks, remarked that it felt like the site itself was resisting their efforts. By the second day of excavation, they had managed to dig down approximately 2 meters in the center of the target area, but the work was exhausting and plagued by constant technical problems. Cameras malfunctioned, digital storage corrupted. Even simple mechanical tools seemed to work against them, with handles breaking and metal fatiguing in ways that should not have happened to new equipment. The mood in camp grew tense and irritable. People snapped at each other over minor issues. Sleep became difficult in the oppressive heat, and when sleep did come, it brought unwelcome visitors. 3 members of the team, independently and without prior discussion, reported having nearly identical nightmares on the 3rd night. They each dreamed of standing at the edge of the excavation pit, looking down into darkness that extended far deeper than they had dug. In each dream, figures emerged from that darkness, not quite human in form, moving with wrongness that was felt rather than clearly seen. And in each dream, a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself told them to leave, to stop, to seal what they had opened. When they compared these experiences over breakfast, the realization that they had shared elements of the same dream created a fear that rational explanation could not easily dismiss. Margaret had stopped coming to the dig site entirely by this point. She remained in her tent, refusing to approach the excavation. When Kincaid pressed her, she finally admitted that her visions had completely reversed. Instead of being shown what lay beneath the ground, she was now being shown what would happen if they continued. She described images of the site becoming a wound in the earth, something escaping or being released. Though she could not define what that something was, she begged Kincaid to stop the excavation and fill in what they had already dug. Kincaid refused. They had found nothing yet, which he attributed to simply not having reached the depth where the anomalies existed. The radar had shown clear signals at 4 to 6 meters down, and they had only reached 2 meters. He pushed the team to work longer hours to overcome the equipment issues through persistence and redundancy. But the dig itself seemed to be fighting them. The soil, which should have been relatively easy to work with based on geological surveys, proved unexpectedly difficult. Layers of rock that had not shown up on any preliminary analysis appeared with frustrating regularity. Tools went missing, only to be found in locations where no one remembered leaving them. On the 7th day, they finally reached a depth of just over 4 meters. According to the original radar survey, they should have encountered the first of the anomalies. Instead, they found nothing but undisturbed earth and bedrock. No chambers, no artifacts, no evidence that anything human-made had ever existed in that location. Kincaid ordered core samples to be taken deeper, desperate to understand how the radar could have been so definitively wrong. But even that simple procedure failed when the coring equipment jammed and then shattered. A malfunction the equipment manufacturer would later state was virtually impossible given the specifications of both the tool and the substrate. That night, the shared nightmares intensified. This time, all 5 team members, including Kincaid himself, experienced variations of the same vision. They stood around the pit, and from its depths came not figures but a presence, something that existed in the space between perception and reality. It communicated not in words, but in pure feeling, conveying rage at the intrusion, warning that some barriers exist for reasons beyond human understanding, and promising consequences if they persisted. James Kincaid suffered what would later be clinically described as an acute psychological episode the following morning. Team members found him at dawn, sitting at the edge of the excavation, speaking to the empty air in a language none of them recognized. When they managed to pull him back to camp, he was initially incoherent, cycling between terror and manic insistence that they had to fill in the pit immediately, that they had to seal it properly, that something was aware of them now, and they had to undo what they had done. The expedition was abandoned that day. 2 team members drove Kincaid to the nearest hospital, while the others began the process of refilling the excavation. Even that proved difficult, with equipment continuing to malfunction and a sense of oppressive dread that made the work feel dangerous in ways they could not articulate. Margaret Hollis refused to help, remaining in the vehicle with the doors locked until the work was complete. Kincaid spent 3 weeks in psychiatric care, eventually stabilizing but fundamentally changed by the experience. He resigned from his university position, ceased all archaeological work, and relocated to a coastal town in Queensland where he now works in a bookstore. He has given only one interview about the 1998 expedition, and in it, he stated that he believes they touched something that humanity is not meant to understand, something that predates modern civilization and exists in a category beyond conventional archaeology or science. The site itself was officially documented, and through channels that remain unclear, arrangements were made for ongoing monitoring. Local indigenous communities were consulted, and the location has been placed under what amounts to informal protection. No further excavation has been attempted. Ground-penetrating radar has never been returned to verify the original anomalies, and the question of whether those readings were genuine, mistaken, or somehow manipulated remains unanswered. Margaret Hollis has never spoken publicly about the expedition beyond confirming her participation. She refuses all interview requests and is said to have given up psychic work entirely. According to second-hand accounts from people who knew her afterward, she confided to a close friend that in her final vision at the site, she saw not the past, but a possible future in which the excavation succeeded. And what emerged from beneath the earth spread like a contagion of wrongness, affecting not just the immediate area but expanding outward in ways that defy geographical logic. To this day, the 1998 expedition remains a footnote in archaeological records, dismissed by mainstream academia as a cautionary tale about pseudoscience and the importance of proper methodology. But for those who were there, and for the indigenous elders who delivered their warning, the truth is more complex and far more unsettling. Was Margaret Hollis simply wrong? Her psychic impressions nothing more than imagination given false validation by equipment error? Were the Aboriginal warnings based on genuine spiritual protection of a sacred site, with the failures and nightmares representing indigenous power, safeguarding what should not be disturbed? Or is there a darker possibility that certain places on this earth are shielded from discovery, not by human agency, but by something else entirely? Something that knows when it is being sought and possesses the means to defend itself. The site remains sealed, marked only by GPS coordinates in restricted files, and whatever lies beneath 4 meters of red earth continues to keep its secrets, protected by technology failure, shared nightmares, and warnings from those who understand that some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed again. The documented successes refuse to go away. They sit in filing cabinets and research archives, stubborn anomalies that neither prove nor disprove the central question. A psychic describes a specific artifact in a location no one has excavated. The dig happens months or years later, and there it is, exactly as described. Mainstream archaeology dismisses it as coincidence, but the documentation is thorough, the details too specific. We are left in an uncomfortable middle ground, holding evidence too substantial to ignore yet too radical to integrate into accepted scientific frameworks. Consider the sites that remain untouched. There are locations around the world where psychics have provided detailed information about what lies beneath the soil. Coordinates have been recorded. Descriptions of structures and artifacts sit in notebooks and audio recordings. Yet the excavations never happen. Sometimes it is a matter of funding, the eternal limitation of archaeological work. Sometimes it is ethics, the recognition that disturbing certain grounds violates the wishes of descendant communities. But sometimes, and this is the part that lingers in the mind during quiet moments, it is fear. Fear of what confirmation would mean for our understanding of consciousness, of time, of the boundaries we have drawn around acceptable knowledge. There are researchers who whisper about these places. A temple complex in Southeast Asia, described in detail by someone who has never traveled beyond their home country. A burial ground in Eastern Europe, its contents catalogued by a psychic, who later refused to discuss what else they sensed there. A pre-Columbian site in the Americas where the visions were so disturbing that the sensitive who described it asked that the information be sealed. These locations exist in a strange liminal space, neither confirmed nor denied, waiting. The academic silence is perhaps the most telling aspect of this entire phenomenon. There have been successes that cannot be easily explained away. Archaeologists have quietly consulted psychics and then published papers attributing discoveries to traditional methodology. Research teams have followed hunches that came from non-scientific sources, then carefully constructed rational narratives for how they chose their excavation sites. The documentation exists if you know where to look, if you can read between the lines of published research, if you speak privately with professionals after conferences when the official conversations have ended. Why does mainstream archaeology continue to reject these methods? The answers are complex and layered. There's a legitimate concern about reproducibility, the cornerstone of scientific inquiry. Psychic impressions cannot be reliably replicated under controlled conditions. There is the fear of opening the floodgates to pseudoscience, of legitimizing approaches that could undermine decades of methodological rigor. There is professional reputation, the very real concern that association with psychic methodology could end careers and close doors to funding. But beneath these practical considerations lies something deeper, a fundamental unease about what these successes might imply about the nature of reality itself. If consciousness can somehow access information across time and space, what does that mean for our materialist understanding of the universe? If traumatic historical events create detectable ripples through the centuries, ripples that sensitive individuals can perceive, then we must reconsider our models of how time works, how information persists, how the past relates to the present. These are not comfortable questions for a discipline built on stratigraphy and carbon dating, on the careful measurement of physical evidence. The question of temporal consciousness refuses simple answers. Does information somehow embed itself in locations, waiting to be perceived by those with the capacity to receive it? Do objects carry memories of the hands that made them, the lives that touched them? Some of the psychics who have worked on archaeological projects describe their experiences not as seeing the past, but as the past pressing itself upon them, demanding to be acknowledged. They speak of sites that call out, of artifacts that want to be found, of histories that refuse to stay buried. This introduces an ethical dimension that extends beyond standard archaeological practice. If some things genuinely call out to be discovered, do we have an obligation to answer? Or are there histories that should remain undisturbed, knowledge that serves no good purpose in being brought to light? The psychics who have described certain unexcavated sites often report overwhelming sensations of grief, terror, or suffering. They speak of places where violence was so extreme that it left an imprint, a wound in the fabric of whatever connects past to present. Should such places be excavated simply because we can, or does wisdom sometimes lie in leaving certain grounds undisturbed? The buried truth of psychic archaeology is that it exists in the margins, unacknowledged but persistent. Professionals use it while denying it. Evidence accumulates while remaining unpublished. Success stories circulate through informal networks while official discourse maintains firm boundaries between science and intuition. We have created a system where certain knowledge cannot be spoken aloud, where certain methods cannot be credited, even when they produce results. And so we return to the fundamental mysteries. At dig sites around the world, discoveries emerge from the earth. The published reports describe careful survey work, ground-penetrating radar, analysis of historical documents, logical deduction based on settlement patterns and environmental factors. But in how many cases did the real impetus come from a dream, a vision, a sudden inexplicable certainty about where to dig? How many archaeologists have stood at a site and known, without being able to explain how they knew, exactly where to place their first test trench? These experiences go unrecorded in the official literature, but they happen. They continue to happen. The question is not whether they occur, but what they mean and why we cannot bring ourselves to examine them systematically. Perhaps some things resist systematic examination. Perhaps the phenomena that psychic archaeology investigates exist precisely in the spaces where our current scientific frameworks break down. Perhaps consciousness and time operate according to principles we have not yet discovered, principles that become visible only at the edges of our understanding. Or perhaps we are pattern-seeking creatures so gifted at finding meaning that we convince ourselves of connections that do not exist, building elaborate structures of significance around nothing more than coincidence and confirmation bias. The uncomfortable truth is that we do not know. The documented successes exist. The failures exist in equal measure. The implications stretch in directions that challenge our fundamental assumptions about reality. And somewhere beneath the soil, at coordinates recorded in files that gather dust, lie sites described by people who should not have been able to describe them. Waiting. Whether they wait for vindication or deserve to remain undisturbed, we cannot say. We know only that they are there, and that the questions they raise refuse to be buried along with the artifacts they supposedly contain. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.